Hi, everyone. Welcome back to SocialS 221, Introduction to Research Methods. Okay, week 3, we are all into literature reviews, an important step in any research that you conduct. I'm looking for a literature review in your final term papers for your research projects this term. And this video is all about how to conduct a literature review in general, and more specifically with the resources that we have access to here at the University of Waterloo. So let's get started. Okay, so what is a literature review? What is the point of a literature review? I've got it up here on the slide, right? It's a critical account of what has already been published on the topic of your research, right? So its purpose is to demonstrate to a reader or the readers in general, your established knowledge on a topic and the strengths, weaknesses, or gaps of those ideas in order to situate your work in the context of its contribution to the general topic, right? So I've said this before last week in my week 2 video. I'll say it again. Regardless of what topic you end up going with this term, what you want to study in your term research projects, they're all hopefully lots of exciting topics. You've already kind of started sending them my way, seeing if they're okay. We start to see them in discussion posts. They look all exciting and great. But I can guarantee you that someone has already looked at either that specific topic or topics very closely related to it in prior studies across Canada, the US, or in Europe or other countries. And so it's important to go and see what those people have already found, what they've said, in order to kind of look at, okay, what have these studies done well? What do they actually tell us about the topic? But what are still the gaps in our knowledge? What do we still not know about this topic that I'm interested in? So maybe you're interested in attitudes towards the environment. Maybe you're interested in religious practice in Canada, or a whole variety of other topics, all of them great. But you also have to realize you're not doing this research in a vacuum. There have been lots of people before who focus on these topics. And so you want to go and see what they've already found so that you're not replicating the research, right? So that you're building on it instead. So they're like, okay, this is what we know about this topic. This is what we still don't know. So here's what I'm going to do as a research to kind of push our knowledge forward, right? So you're joining the conversation, right? So you're joining this larger research conversation going on your research focus, right? First by listening to what is being said or what has been said by others, and then formulating a comment designed to advance the dialogue, right? So it's a quote by Downey. So a literature review is not just summarizing what others have said, though. There's other aspects to a literature review. So when I get your term papers at the end of this term, and if you're just like, okay, Article 1, this is what they said. Article 2, this is what they said. Article 3, this is what they said. Haha, move on. It is important to summarize what others have said, obviously, because the person reading your project won't understand what you're talking about if you're not summarizing what other people have said before in your literature review. But it's not the only element, right? So we're also looking for a synthesis component and an analysis component to your literature reviews. So synthesis, right? So initially, yes, you summarize the articles, but synthesis is you're looking for patterns in the literature, right? So like, oh, this is interesting. There seems to be this school of thought here who thinks this about this topic, has looked at this aspect of the topic. And then this other school of thought, maybe using a different theoretical framework that's looking at this, has a slightly different focus. And here's what they've produced in terms of studies. And here's the gap that we still have in the knowledge. Here's, this aspect hasn't been covered by existing studies, right? So it's kind of finding these patterns. It can be kind of more recognizing studies that are more general, and then realizing that some studies are kind of more specific within that, or finding any other kind of pattern that is out there that you feel is relevant and that you structure your literature review around. So I'll give you an example. I did a literature review recently for one of the articles that I was studying, that I was writing. Actually, it was a book chapter that I was writing on religious polarization. Right. And I found that there was a whole bunch of different literature that was relevant for that. There were a few studies that had actually, had religious polarization in the title and had looked at, how are religious and non-religious groups different from one another in society in terms of their attitudes? How do they clash in terms of, do they like each other? Do they not like each other? So there was that kind of smaller body of literature. And then there was a whole other sector, if you will, of literature that was on polarization in general, especially political polarization, that didn't necessarily talk about religion, but was still very relevant. So would show that there's different dimensions to polarization, right? We can be talking about what we call affective polarization. So that's where two groups have negative attitudes towards one another, right? It's often based on stereotypes, and there's kind of strong group boundaries between them, right? Like if you're in one group, you're the in group, and the other group is definitely defined as an out group that you kind of distinguish your identity from. So that's a form of affective polarization, but there's also other types of polarization, like issue polarization. So in terms of people's attitudes on certain socio-political issues, like abortion, like same-sex marriage, and how those attitudes are different between two different groups, say religious and non-religious individuals. And so, right, and there's different groups of literature related to this. So there's some people who focused on affective polarization, some on different political issue polarization, especially from literature coming from the US. And then there's also a smaller group looking specifically at religious polarization. So these affective and issue polarization, but between different religious groups or between religious and non-religious individuals in our societies. So I had to kind of, I had to cover all that literature, I had to read all of it, and I had to then figure out that pattern, right? Be like, okay, so this is, this kind of falls more into this one section of this literature. Here's some other, and here's how they kind of speak to each other or not. And here's what's important, especially from each one, that's important for the study that I'm going to do, especially how they define their concepts. Right, so how is polarization defined, and what aspects of that do I want to use for my own study, and what variables they're looking at, their existing findings, what we already know, so that I'm not replicating those studies, but I'm building on them. So, okay, so there's still, we know this, but we don't know this. Here's this gap. And so this is my research question that's going to fill that gap in our knowledge. And then, so that's kind of like a synthesis element to a literature review, right? It's finding those patterns to kind of not just here's article 1, here's article 2, here's article 3, but could kind of fit this literature and show the kind of patterns within it on the topic that you're interested in studying. And then finally, there's the analysis component, right? So you're not just summarizing existing research, you're also thinking critically about it. And thinking critically doesn't just necessarily mean like this is what they did wrong and this is what's terrible about this existing study. It's more highlighting the strengths and weaknesses of existing research. Like here's this existing body of literature. This is what it does well. This is what it's showing and what it's focusing on. But this is its weakness. This is still what we don't know, kind of its gaps, what it's not doing so well, what it hasn't focused on in the past. And that's usually where you kind of fit yourself in and be like, okay, that's why I'm here. It's important for me to conduct this new study because we still haven't really looked at this aspect of the topic. So I'm going to do that in my own research project, right? So that's what you're doing in writing a literature review. You're not just summarizing existing research, but you're also finding patterns within it and critically and analyzing it. And all of that I'm looking for in that literature review section of your final research project. Okay, so that was a big kind of overview of what literature reviews are, but practically, how do you actually conduct them with what we have access to here at the University of Waterloo? Well, a great place to start is the library's website. I don't know if you've visited the University of Waterloo's library website so far, but it is an incredibly important resource for you throughout your degree and including for this course. I'm recording this because our course is given remotely this term. I'm not really sure at this point what the library situation is, if it's sort of open, if it's mostly closed, depending on the COVID-19 restrictions at the time. But you do have great resources online, regardless of what the COVID-19 situation is. And so I want to share some of those with you in this video today. So University of Waterloo library website, it's centralized. It's at lib.uwaterloo.ca. There's the link below. I'm going to go over the next few slides and I'm going to switch the screen share and we'll go and look at the actual website together and I'll click on a few places to show you what you can do. All right. So here, just kind of highlighting a few key areas of the homepage. This is the homepage that you get when you go to the library. We'll come back to those. We'll look at those in a few minutes together. Okay, so you're starting out your literature review. You've got the library's website open. What's the first step in conducting a literature review? Well, it's pretty much the first step with any kind of research that you're going to do. you have to figure out what you're going to study, right? What is your topic? What is your research question? What do you want to know? This sounds pretty obvious, but it really isn't. That's sometimes the most difficult step in research, because there's the wonderful thing, but also the daunting thing about sociology and legal studies is there's so much to study, right? The social world and the legal worlds are vast. So what do you focus on, right? Like even this term, our theme of shared networks, attitudes and behaviors, shared attitudes and behaviors in social networks, that still allows a lot of possibilities of research. So you got to find kind of what interests you. And last week, there was a course material on how you go about selecting your topic, but it's also a process that you're probably still working through in the first few weeks, and that's okay. But you do have to start thinking, okay, what is it I'm going to study? What am I going to do for this research project this term? And start to kind of hone in on those key research questions that you're going to be answering with your data collection and analysis this term. Okay, so once you've figured that out, or at least you're on the path to figuring that out, then it's time to, start looking for some existing literature to see what's out there. And the different steps feed into each other. So for example, once you've done your literature review, it's okay if your research question shifts a bit. Be like, oh, okay, actually the question I was asking, a lot of people have already studied it, but I've noticed there's this gap in the existing literature, and I think I want to go in this direction instead. Or, oh, hey, I found this really cool existing study, and I like to do more on that, kind of more specifically in that theme. So I'm going to shift my research questions a bit to match that, to better match that. And that's okay. That's part of the process as well. So it's kind of a flexible, porous, evolving process that you go through in terms of what your research questions are as you go and look at this existing literature. But you figure out, at least initially, the topic that you want to focus on, a few key concepts or words that you want to focus on, and then you start searching through the library's catalog, as well as there's some sociology research databases to find scientific articles and book chapters and books, and we'll get to that in a moment. And so you got to start kind of figuring out what it is you want to study, identify some key words there, some key concepts that you're going to start looking up in the library's catalog or the databases. Okay. So I have an example here, example that's sort of related to my substantive area as a researcher, but one that I've never actually studied a whole lot. And maybe I'm interested in knowing, how do religious identities impact attitudes towards climate change? So depending on which religious tradition you're more affiliated with, or if you're not affiliated with a religious tradition at all, do attitudes towards climate change seem to vary between those religious affiliations. So if you're Muslim, if you're evangelical Christian, if you're Anglican, if you're Buddhist, if you're Hindu, if you're Sikh, if you're non-religious, if you identify strongly as an atheist, do we see different approaches or attitudes towards climate change between those different religious identities? So maybe that's a question. I don't have the answer to that question. Maybe that's a question that I'm interested in studying, but I'm sure people have already studied this topic. So I want to conduct a literature review ahead of time to go and see what they've said before I actually move forward with my own research. Okay, so at this stage, say that we're going to follow along with my example of the relationship between religious identities and attitudes towards climate change. Of course, when you're watching this video, you can use your own example of your own research questions that you're going to use this term. But with that question in mind, what would you do to move forward with this? What would you do in terms of a literature review? I don't know if this is the first literature review you've ever had to do. Maybe you've already had to do one for your first or second year university courses, or prior to that in high school, or in some other context. Maybe you've been on the job and you've had to do a little project and you had to do a literature review. So where have you looked for literature in the past, right? And we're talking more about here scientific literature. So this is peer-reviewed articles, books, and book chapters. They've gone through that peer review process, right? So this is where, to give you a sense of what that peer review process is, right? When I go through this process, I write my research article that presents my research findings. I submit it to a journal. The journal sends it out to two of my colleagues or peers in a blind process, so they don't know that it was me who wrote it. I don't know who they are. They do a critical assessment of the article, send the feedback back to the editor, tell the editor, is it worth publishing or not? And then the editor gets the feedback back to me, and the editor says, okay, you can improve your article. Here's the feedback from the external reviewers, or we're not going to publish your article. The external reviewers decided it wasn't worth publishing. All right, so that's the kind of peer review process. I update the article, resubmit it, and then the editor decides to publish it or not. So that process can be done with journal articles with edited volumes, with books. And it's usually, a journal will call itself a peer-reviewed journal if they follow that process. The books, the edit volumes and the kind of monograph books, those are usually university presses who have a peer review process, although there's a few others that also do, like Routledge, for example. And so those are what qualify scientific work, scientific studies in our disciplines. And that's what I want you to focus on in your literature reviews. And so if you had to go and search for scientific works on, in this example, the themes of religious identity and climate change, or whatever your topic's going to be this term, where would you usually start, right? What would be the place that you usually start? Think about it. Where would you usually start this process? Well, like I said, the library catalog is a good place to start. There's also databases that are like Proquest, like ERIC, like Cyverse, that are also great places to search for scientific works. But probably most of you would go for Google Scholar. if my previous experience with teaching this course is any indication, and also my prior experience as a researcher in general, Google Scholar these days is a really popular place to search for scientific works. It does have some benefits to it, right? It's freely available. It's very easy to access. You just open a Google page, put in Scholar. That's the first thing that shows up in the search. You click on it, then you're in Google Scholar and you start searching for your keywords or your concepts. You can connect to Google Scholar through the library. And the advantage of doing that is if the library, the University of Waterloo Library, actually has that scientific article, it'll show it next to your Google search in Scholar. So if you just do it without connecting through the library, you'll just get a whole list, but you don't know, you'll have to then go and access it through the library as another step. But if you access Google Scholar through the library, and there's a way to do that, I'll show you how to do that. So you're already signed into your library account with your Watt ID and password. You access Google Scholar through the library. Then when you search for anything Google Scholar, the library will put the link right next to it about how you access that article, that book chapter, that book through the library directly. So it's a little bit quicker usually, so it's good to do. You can set your own preferences. You can import your own citation manager software or technique if you like. You can also see who else has been citing the work that you're looking at in Google Scholar. It also includes theses and dissertations, which I don't really want you to cite this term. But there are some pretty big drawbacks to using Google Scholar to look up existing literature. There's not a whole lot of search tips. It's quite difficult to understand how search terms are actually interpreted by Google Scholar, mainly because since it's proprietary software, Google is kind of quiet, is purposely keeps how the searches, the algorithms that actually run these searches, that's proprietary information. And so they don't release that. That's not public. So we don't know exactly what Google is doing when it's searching through its databases. That being said, we have a good idea of what it's doing, but we're never exactly sure about that. And so it's difficult sometimes to kind of, get what you want out of it because it's hard to understand exactly what's going on with Google Scholar. You can only really refine by date. It's hard to refine certain searches. It'll often give you like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of hits. And that's not helpful. It's like too much, right? Like we don't live in a day and age where there's too little information. We live in a day and age where there's almost too much information about a lot of things. So there's like, say, if you're interested in social capital and you put social capital in Google Scholar, you're going to get like 28 million hits or something insane, right? That's not helpful for you to search. And so sometimes it's actually better to go with a more specialized database, which I'll get to in a minute, that can hone in on the more kind of sociology, legal studies works that you're looking for rather than going through Google Scholar. And it's hard to kind of have a specific focus in Google Scholar. It'll often bring up stuff that's kind of less relevant for you. So I would recommend instead going with the library catalog or with some of the sociology, included in that is also legal studies, research databases, where you'll probably get a lot more of what you're looking for. It focuses in especially on those scientific works, and you're able to kind of play around with your searches to refine them so that you actually get articles, book chapters, books that are relevant for you and for your topic and for your literature review this term. Again, I'll keep going through these slides and then we'll do it together a little bit in our web browser in a few moments. Okay. So another kind of added resource this term for you all through the library, with Sarah Brown, and with previous instructors for this course this term, you have access to our course library webpage. And so that's the SocLS 221 library webpage, where there's a list of these sociology and legal studies databases that you can go to and start using to kind of search for your existing literature. Right. So I've got the link up here on this in the video here, but I'll show you how to get there through your web browser in a few minutes. Okay, so how do you kind of play with a database? How do you kind of maximize your searches in a database? There's a whole YouTube video after this about that, and it'll give you lots more tips. But there's a few key ones I want to highlight here in this video as well. So how do you speak database, right? To kind of refine your search so that you get relevant results and not like 28 million hits that aren't that relevant. So there's things, so for our example of the research question that I'm going with, instead of including climate and change separately without quotation marks, that would give me, if I just put that into a database, that would give me like all of the articles that have keywords of climate in them, which some might be relevant, some not so much. And then a whole bunch of other scientific works that have change as a keyword in them. So that could include climate change, but that could also include social change, political change, whatever. And that's way too broad, right? So the way to kind of get around that is to put quotation marks so that the database searches for those two words together as keywords or in the title or in the abstract. And so that's kind of hopefully going to get you a lot more relevant literature to look through. And, you know, I use the word religious in my research question. So that's probably another keyword that I'd like to focus on for my literature review. But, you know, related to that, religiosity might also be relevant. So one way I can quickly look for all of those options is just to put the first root of the word, so in this case, relig, and then put a star. And then you get all of these options, anything that comes with relig at the start, and then afterwards, it might get some other words I'm just not thinking of that have nothing to do with religion, but for the most part, it'll give you all the kind of words related to religion. So it could be like religion and climate change, religiosity and climate change, religious identity and climate change, right? So it can give all these options, which might be relevant for what I'm looking for. Another example here would be crime, right? So you could put crim, CRIM, and star. And so then you'd get crime, criminality, criminology, right? So you get a variety of different options there. But you would also get some things that are maybe less relevant that don't really have much to do with crime, such as Crimea, right? The former region of Ukraine that has been willfully or unwillfully taken over by Russia. Right, you could get crimson, right? Like the color rather than crime, right? So there are some downsides to doing that as well, but you can play around with it to see if it's relevant for you, right? Okay, so one last thing before we actually switch the screen share to the web browser that I want to come back to is, right, I've kind of highlighted two keywords, two key concepts I want to search for: climate change and religiosity or religion or religious. Right. But you also want to think of, you know, are there any synonyms there that might also bring me back relevant literature review? So climate change, maybe I also want to search for global warming, right? Oh, okay. So I'll put that in quotation marks, global warming, right? Another term that's often used. Religious, maybe I also want to search for spiritual or faith, right? Those are terms that might also be relevant in this case. And you also want to think, you know, are there any other keywords or concepts that I should be looking for to get me this kind of relevant literature? And, you know, this process is going to happen in rounds or in waves or in stages, if you will. You do a first search, you get some stuff back. You realize that maybe you got a bit relevant stuff, but for the most part, it didn't really work. So you adjust your search in the database. You get a second round of literature. You find a little bit more relevant stuff. You do a third round where you get even more relevant literature. And then maybe you start looking at the bibliography, the sources that are cited in the articles and book chapters that are found, right? So you find a book chapter that's super relevant for what you're studying. Well, it's worth going to look at their bibliography at the end and who they're citing. And maybe you want also to go and look at some of that literature because it might also be part of this relevant discussion. Okay. All right. So let's go and try this out. I'm going to stop the screen share. Hi, you can see me full screen now. I'm going to switch to the web browser so we can go and have a look at the library webpage for a few minutes together. Okay. So here we are. Here's the library webpage. So this is again lib.uwaterloo.ca if you haven't ever been. You can just go ahead and start searching if you want. Here you see, this is their kind of main search catalog engine here. That's often what I do if I'm looking for specific literature. That's how I'll go straight to that. And that then looks through all the different articles and databases that the library has access to, which is quite a bit. But there's also these different options here on the right-hand side, the quick links. There's also, if you scroll down a bit, there's information for undergraduate students, would be especially relevant for you. So there's different ways of kind of initially going into the library world, if you will. And, so often just searching right off the bat is a good way of doing it. But what I also want to do was I want to look at this quick link of research guides with you, because this will bring us to that course page, the Soc LS 221 course page that has been set up in the library for you students who are taking the course, and that will have access to those different sociology and legal studies databases to look up your existing literature. So if we click on research guides, and then that brings you to a subject list. So we scroll all the way down to find sociology and legal studies. We're one of the last ones here, sociology and legal studies. And there are other pages for just legal research that have been set up, but we're going today for sociology and legal studies. Okay, so you click on that. And then here you can start, there's more options. We've got Ryan, who's our guy in sociology and legal studies. If you want to need help from our librarian, he's our guy. So just shoot him an email, be like, hey, I'm looking for this literature on the topic of climate change and religion. I'm not finding a whole lot. Can you give me a few tips? Can you give me a hand? He's always there to help. And so definitely try go and shoot Ryan an email if you do need help using any of the library resources, including conducting your literature reviews through the library. Right, there's find books, find articles, right? How can I tell if an article is peer reviewed, right? Some tips here. And here we see sociology databases here on the right. So, well, let's go for Proquest. There's a lot of good ones. And so you can try out a few. My personal favorites are Proquest, Scopus, and JSTAR, the first three. Those tend to be the most popular ones. JSTAR is a bit more historical. It doesn't have so much like current day relevant stuff in the last 5 or 10 years. But still, if you're doing a longer search back, JSTOR can be helpful. But the other databases are also good, including here Google Scholar. But let's go to Proquest. And let's click on Proquest. Okay. Aha, I have to log in. Busted. So this is good. You can see the whole process, right? Where you're going to log in with your regular Watt ID and password. I've already logged in for other stuff, so it brings me directly to Proquest. And here is our big sociology database. Okay, so I'm just chatting here because I'm actually going to go and copy and paste some of the terms that I want to search in my database here. And so you can't see that, but that's what I'm doing. And so the first term that I'm going to look for is climate change, but again, in quotation marks. And I believe I'm going to put and relig with the little star there. Okay. And here it also, interestingly, gives me different selections of different subjects of religion that I could go with, but I'll just kind of keep it broad, right? So I'm going to see if that works, right? So the idea here is I'm looking for anything that has climate change in the kind of title, abstract, key places, and also that has relig somewhere in those title abstracts, right? So articles, book chapters, books that are together. So let's see what that brings back. Right, so I put the and here in the first search, but there's also, I could have put climate change and then and. We can go back and try different things because some of the databases are like a little bit different from one another. So like some databases you can put the and symbol and it'll work. Others you have to like put it in each word in like a separate little box or something. So we'll see if it worked, and then if not, we'll go back. Looking here, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of relevant literature. Rethinking peace and international law and politics from a queer feminist perspective. I'm sure that's an interesting scientific work. It's not really what I was looking for in terms of something looking at the link between climate change and religious identity, or attitudes towards climate change and religious identity. So yeah, not a very successful search. Okay, so in that case, going to go back. And we're going to try it again. So going to go with climate change. This time I'll put relig here in the little second box here to see if that actually does anything. So let's search that. It might not, we'll see. But this is the stuff that you play around with. No, in the end, it didn't do anything different. It's the same, not super relevant. Okay. Okay. But this is a normal process. Like I want you to see this as this kind of troubleshooting process. You try out different things. So let me in that climate change, and then let's do and religion. Okay, maybe let's try religion. Nope. Okay, sorry. Climate change and religion. Let's do that. Let's try that. And if you're bored now, if you're used to using these databases, you're welcome just to skip this part if you're more familiar with using them already. And so, yeah, but just kind of go through this process together to see what we get. Yeah, I'm not getting a huge amount, eh? That's problematic. Oh, well, I'll just have to keep going. But this is part of the process, right? So don't expect all of the literature to just fall out of the sky initially, right? You should, have to do this kind of process a few times with different databases. So maybe Proquest isn't all that helpful here, right? So maybe in this case, what I want is I'm going to go out of that page. I'll switch my screen share to make sure you can still see it with me. And then maybe in that case, I'm going to go back to the library webpage, but I'm going to try a different database this time. Okay, so back to the library homepage, research guides. Let's go find it. Sociology and legal studies, sociology and legal studies. I found under find articles, that was where all the databases were listed, but also under course guides, we could go directly to it's called just Soc 221 here, course, and that's our actual course homepage for the course. And also here you see different databases, other suggested databases. So let's try Scopus this time, see if we come up with anything in Scopus. And it depends the topic that you're interested in. If there's a lot of literature on a topic, then you might find more stuff across a variety of databases. If it's a more specialized topic, like the one I'm kind of looking for at the moment, you might have to dig a little bit more. And that's all part of the process, and it's okay, right? So be patient, give yourself lots of time to do this. And that's just part of it. And this right scope is telling us looking at article titles and abstracts and keywords. Okay. Okay, so here now, this is a little bit more relevant, right? So this is a little bit more successful this was Scopus again, right? I've still got 421 results, that's a lot. But some of this is more relevant. So for example, here, the second one, climate change, emotions and religion, imagining the future in Central Oceania. Okay. Introduction, climate change and Pacific Christianities. Oh, that could be relevant, right? And it's showing me where it's coming from. So the journal that's in this case is Anthropological Forum. And so I just keep going through, right? So, this is a process. You go through, you find the literature that's relevant for you. And again, you have to kind of do it in waves or in stages where you kind of hone in more and more into the literature that you're interested in. All to the point where for this term, I want you to get 3 scientific works for your literature, a minimum of 3. Here we go. I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again, right? We're looking for a minimum of 3 scientific works for your research projects this term, but they do have to be relevant works, right? So it's not just the first 3 that you find, it's 3 that are really relevant for whatever your research questions or topic are, and they have to be pretty recent. So I don't want articles from like the 80s or 90s because usually the field has moved on since then. I'm looking for articles, book chapters, books that are more recent than that. So I had a colleague who used to say, like, it can't be older than my old BMW, which was like a 94 BMW or something. I don't know if that colleague still has that car, probably not. But in our case, I'm putting 2000 as the cutoff date. If anything's older than 2000, don't bother, it's probably too old. The discussion's probably moved on. So look at stuff in the 2000s, 2010s, and more recently in the early 2020s. Okay, so that's the process of conducting that literature review, actually finding your literature. So I'll let you have fun with that. And like I said, the next video is that YouTube video. It's a quick one. It just kind of gives you a sense of, how do you kind of speak database. It gives you some more details I didn't have the chance to cover here in this video. Okay, but what do you do once you found your literature, right? What's kind of what's the next step? Once you've actually done your searches of the databases, you found your articles, book chapters, books that are peer-reviewed, that are relevant for your study. Well, again, I'm looking for a minimum of 3, no older than 2000. Well, there's different ways that you can actually write up your literature review, different ways of communicating what you found of regarding existing studies in writing, and to kind of convey that information, right? Summary, synthesis, analysis in your final research paper. Again, what I'm not looking for, what I don't want you to do in your final research paper with your literature review, I don't want you just to go one by one and just give a summary of each one. Like, okay, this is the first article I found, here's what they say. This is the second article I found, here's what they say. Here's a third article I found, here's what they say. Boom, I'm moving on. You will get some points for the literature review for that, but not all the points and not the majority of points, right? Instead, I'm looking for a kind of more thorough synthesis and analysis of that literature. So discuss the different schools of thought, approaches, or general findings for which each contains a series of works in the field, right? So how does that literature kind of tie into each other? Where does it stand? Is it talking to each other? Is it two completely different ways of approaching your topic? Or you can, again, talk about some works that are kind of more general, that are looking at the topic in general, and then other works that are kind of looking at more specific aspects of your topic, right? Or some people will go with a chronological discussion of the field, be like, okay, in the 80s and 90s, these were the trends that we were seeing in the literature. That's moved on. Now this is more what we're focused on in the 2010s, 2020s. Right, again, the chronological discussion might not be so helpful for you this term because I'm looking for newer works. So maybe you'd only do it between 2000 and 2020 if you see a real difference between the literature that you're finding across that period. I would go rather with the first two. So kind of discussing different patterns that you find in literature review that's more current in the last 20 years or so, right? Or any other way that you feel is relevant to organize your literature reviews. And there's, the readings this week are discussing that, right? Different ways that you can do that organization so that your literature is not just like a point-by-point summary of the articles, but goes beyond that and really has that synthesis component and then analytical discussion, which is what we're looking for. Right? So with that literature review, we should get an understanding of what we know about the topic, what we already know based on existing research, what we still don't know, so our gaps in the knowledge. And again, that kind of leads you nicely then to present your own research questions to fill those gaps in the knowledge, right? I've mentioned this at the start of this video. That's what we're aiming for with this literature review, right? And as part of what we already know from existing studies, right? Existing findings, but also gaps that are in that existing literature. Right? So this is what we know. This is still what we don't know, gaps. And here's the gaps, at least I'm going to address with my own research. And here's the research question that hasn't been answered yet that I'm going to go and answer with my research. Quick word here. When you're finding a literature review, I'd like you to use the APA. I think this is so many acronyms. American Psychological Association, I believe, citation method. It's one of the more common citation styles we have in sociology and legal studies, but by no means the only one. But I would like you to use that citation style. So that is how you actually cite literature in the text and how you exactly write out the bibliography at the end. There's a whole PDF document on that. That's a reading for this week. You can also just Google, like, how do I cite using APA style? There's lots of different guides out there, so you can go and look. And so this is where you really, like, when you found your literature and you want to include it in the text, you're doing a literature review, right? You have to cite where these ideas are coming from. Well, that's where you want to cite in the text. You usually cite the author's last name and the year of the publication. And then in the bibliography, you include all the information that's listed here, right? So the journal name, but also the volume and the issue number, the year, the page number for the article, if it's an article, the title of the article, the author's full name, or authors, plural, full name, and something similar for book chapters and books as well. So I'll let you go and look at that that PDF document. And so do try and do that for the discussion posts for your answers this week when you're citing. I'm asking you to find an initial round of 3 scientific works. It doesn't have to be the final ones you go with at the end of term, but it is that initial round of relevant scientific works. I want you to explain why they're relevant, but I also want them the full APA citation in your discussion answer, and so that we can see it and we can also comment it if you're still having trouble citing using that APA style. Okay, so that's all I had to say for today. So thanks for listening. I know this was a bit longer video, but hopefully worth it, and hopefully will help you in conducting those literature reviews. And yeah, we look forward to reading your discussion posts this week, all about, you know, that literature that you found on your topic so far. And I look forward to reading your full literature reviews in your final research paper at the end of this term, something that I'll come back to again as we build towards the end of term. I'll come back to talking about what the final research paper, what it's meant to look like, its different components, so that it's very clear in your mind when you go to write it. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video. Bye.